I've been invited to this hangout to discuss things relating to Kent Hovind and other matters of mutual interest with Jackson Wheat, and I appreciate him taking the opportunity to do so. This is a result of Kent's previous appearances with Jackson Wheat earlier last summer. They didn't get to his legal problems, so I offered Jackson Wheat the opportunity to have me on and discuss the legal problems, which Kent typically refuses to publicly address in the face of some informed adversary. So here I am. And the key element to Kent Hovind's legal narrative, which is one of my hobbies and I've been following for some time, is his position on structuring, the cornerstone of his legal narrative, which I consider to be false. And this is what he claims and has claimed for years, and his people have claimed for years, and to my knowledge have never presented any appropriate legal basis for it. Structuring requires 2 or more transactions of $10,000 or less on the same day that total more than $10,000. Kent Hovind has made that statement or a similar statement over and over and over again for a long, long time, and his people have. Interestingly enough, his handler, Ernie Land, has recently tried to distance himself from this and concoct another definition. But Kent, to my knowledge, has never abandoned this claim, and in recent days has reaffirmed it. And despite my best efforts, Kent Hovind, nor any of his people, have been willing to face me or simply post somewhere for my reading the specific legal basis for that claim. Let me read it to you again. Structuring, which was one of the crimes Kent was convicted of, requires 2 or more transactions of $10,000 or less on the same day that total more than $10,000. Now, the crimes Kent was convicted of, he was charged with like 45 structuring violations, and the trial history reflects could have been more, and there could have been other people brought into the prosecution as well, but federal prosecutors have to draw a line somewhere. The crime of structuring occurs when someone structures or conducts a cash transaction in a manner designed to evade the bank reporting rules. Basically, the bank reporting rule is you do a cash transaction over $10,000, they fill out a form. And so in Kent's case, there were 45 instances that they charged him for where he made a withdrawal of less than $10,000. And he was convicted on each count. And the trial record shows, and Kent has even admitted this over and over again, I knew there was a bank reporting rule. Now he tries to dress it up a little bit, but in effect he admits he knew there was a bank reporting rule, and he accuses someone else of telling him, don't make cash transactions of over $10,000 because they'll report you. And so he made these many withdrawals of slightly less than $10,000 through his agents. Typically his wife sent her to make the withdrawals, and that's good enough. You know, you can do it yourself or through an agent. of under $10,000. So Kent knew of the bank reporting rule, and he structured his withdrawals in cash so that the bank would not have to file a report. Any questions?
So what you're saying is he knew of these rules and yet did this thing anyways.
Yes, and it might be noted
Wow.
the part of the context also for why would he do that is he brags in his videos that he effectively has never filed a personal income tax return. And this bank account where all this money was flowing through, millions of dollars, if the government got wind of it, guess what? They might figure out, hey, this guy's running millions of dollars through his account. We can't find a tax return for him. So that's part of the context. Why would he do that? He has an excuse about how he runs his business, why he did it. But he's got a long history of tax evasion, and that's the context. And his personal tax case was not criminally prosecuted, but it was civilly prosecuted. And he likely owes as much as $10 million on his personal income tax account, which includes the monetary fraud penalty. Like in his criminal case, in his civil case, he never really put on a defense either. And so those assessments were made. And as far as I know, he's paid little or nothing against those liabilities. The actual tax and basic penalty amounts are fixed at around $3.5 million. Because they're such old accounts with interest, statutory interest, I estimate it's $10 million or so. He doesn't like to talk about his personal civil tax liabilities. He likes to talk about his criminal case and misrepresent it. In justifying my claim that one transaction under $10,000 in one day is enough to convict him of structuring is reflected in the law and the regulations, more of the regulations. Let me read an excerpt from that. Let's see. Let me read the law first.
Okay.
Applicable excerpt. No person shall, for the purpose of evading the reporting requirements of section such and such, or any regulation prescribed under any such section, structure or assist in structuring or attempt to structure or assist in structuring any transaction with one or more domestic financial institutions. That's where it gives the weight of law to the regulations, in effect. The regulation states in part, a person structures a transaction if that person, acting alone or in conjunction with or on behalf of other persons, conducts or attempts to conduct one or more transactions in currency in any amount at one or more financial institutions on one or more days in any manner for the purpose of evading the reporting requirements. In any manner includes, but is not limited to, the breaking down of a single sum of currency exceeding $10,000 into smaller sums, including sums at or below $10,000, or the conduct of a transaction or series of currency transactions, including transactions at or below $10,000. The transaction or transactions need not exceed the $10,000 reporting threshold at any single financial institution on any single day in order to constitute structuring within the meaning of this definition. I'd like to find out what Kent's response might be to that. Let me read you again.
We do have a question from the audience also for you.
Okay, let me read again. Kent's position.
Okay.
Structuring requires two or more transactions of $10,000 or less on the same day that total more than $10,000. I think for those listening, this is why I prefer written discussions. It's hard to follow when it's live and oral. But the regulations make it clear one transaction under $10,000 on one day is enough, and Kent will not admit to that. The indictment reflects that. The evidence reflects Kent violated that, and the jury convicted him. He filed appeals and 100 motions or so. His conviction stood. I think I'm right on that. Kent's wrong. And as Kent says, why won't they face me? They know I'm right and they're wrong. It may not be applicable with Kent and his science, but I think on this, Kent knows he's wrong. That's why he won't face me, won't face up to what he's done wrong. And even worse, for some, he sent his wife to prison with him over this. He wouldn't let her put up a defense, wouldn't let her make a deal to keep her out of prison, made her sit there and shut up like he did, and they both went to prison. That wife, guess what? Left him after he came home from prison. Unrepentant.
Yeah.
Okay, what's the question?
Right about that. Well, we have a question from the audience. How much total did he withdraw? Or do you know?
The total, as far as the indictment amounts, like $400,000 over like 45 transactions. All of the transactions typically were around $9,500 that he was charged with.
Wow. That's a lot of money.
He was, I think the trial transcript indicates for the years they looked at, he was running more than $1 million, maybe up to $3 million a year through his account. So he had a nice business going, successful business. He traveled all over the world and made money and never filed a tax return.
And so that was the primary reason that he went to jail?
The convictions were for 12 counts of employment tax violations. Some properly refer that to tax evasion, but the lawyers might split hairs of whether it's tax evasion or willful or something or another. He doesn't like people calling it tax evasion, but as a practical matter, that's what it was. He never filed employment tax returns, never withheld any money, never paid over any employment taxes. So you can quibble about that if you want. Most people would say that's tax evasion for all practical purposes. 12 counts, 45 counts of structuring, and 1 count of obstruction.
Yeah, I remember reading about the obstruction of justice. I believe Tony Reed also did a video on Hovind going to prison. And so I probably linked that in the description below. He does the How Creationism Taught Me Real Science series.
Kent and I struck up a conversation using his prison email account while he was in prison, as a result of some of his people contacting me and saying Kent would like to talk to me. And so we set that up, and we had a brief exchange. I tried to be responsive to Kent's questions, and then when I started to press him on my questions, he cut me off. So he sometimes makes like he doesn't know who I am. He knows very well who I am and what my position is. And so it's really theater. What we see publicly of Kent Hovind, I think, is theater. And that's why you'll see me referring to his videos and other appearances as performances. I think that's what we're seeing as far as the public viewing of Kent Hovind.
Well, he can't really, I don't think, say anymore that he doesn't know you, since he mentioned you directly in the video you sent me.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think he's following Rudy Davis's lead as much as he can in never wanting to mention me by name. Rudy Davis came up with that gimmick, and it's kind of humorous to watch and see it demonstrated, as Kent did the other day, when he, in his video, talked about me visiting his compound without ever mentioning my name and calling me a moron and all that stuff. It's not the first time he's made veiled references to me. Once in a while, he will mention me by name, or has. And so it's just one of those things to watch for and see how he handles it over time. Ultimately, he's got a lot of accountability to man up to, in my opinion. And structuring is just key to his legal narrative, but there's so many other things, like sending his wife to prison, the attack against Judge Rogers on an alleged rape statement. There's no good reason to think she ever made, but they put together a little scheme that's gone into his narrative, and over 60 other propositions I'd like to see him address and deal with.
We have another question from the audience, which is, how long was his wife in jail?
She got a year sentence, and I think spent 9 months. Apparently, from reports from Kent's camp, via Ernie Land in particular, but some other sources as well, she did not like prison experiences at all. And
can you blame her?
No, she's fearful, I think, or was, of going back, of being associated with Kent and him doing something that would get her trapped again in that. For 40 years or so, she played what might be admirable, the role of a dutiful fundamentalist Baptist wife, even to the point of sitting silent to patronize her husband, who was willing to let her go to prison. And so she did go to prison. She was, complicit in all the structuring, didn't put on a defense, didn't cut a deal. And for what we know about how our justice system works, he could have kept her out of prison. She could have kept herself out of prison. But Kent controlled the lawyers that represented both of them. She didn't even have independent counsel to protect her interests. And so they sat there, didn't put on a defense, were convicted. My position is they didn't put on a defense because they didn't have one. And I don't believe Kent's story as to why they didn't put on a defense.
And but his story is?
The lawyers told me. The lawyers told me basically the government hadn't proved their case. There's no crime here. you don't need to put on a defense.
Oh yeah, you're saying it was a conspiracy, wasn't it?
Well, if you think that makes sense, that's fine. Maybe you believe Kent's reasoning. He wants to blame anybody for everything instead of accept personal responsibility. The lawyers put me in jail with malpractice. The lawyers, as far as I know, aren't talking either. I don't think they're about to address these issues. But from my coverage of the story over time, and you can read the trial transcript and the sentencing transcripts yourself, form your own opinion.
It's all on your Facebook page, right?
Well, if you look, it's hard to search Facebook, but on the internet you can find the trial and sentencing transcripts a number of places now. And I don't think you'll find any that Kent has published or posted. If he did post any, you might check the dates and see if it was only after I came out with them. I don't know, some time ago, someone came up with the transcripts and provided them to me. And at that time, they started to be publicly available. Kent had years to post his trial transcripts and sentencing reports and never did. Why is that? What's he got to hide? The truth? Yeah, I think that's part of it. And you know, part of the difficulty, you have to be maybe really interested or a fast reader, because there's like 2,000 pages. They're court transcripts, so it's not like they're single spaced and crammed together, but there's 2,000 pages of official trial transcript. It is fascinating for some people and interesting and enlightening. And if you read that and have some basic familiarity with it, and then listen to Kent's side of things, wait a minute, something's not right here. And Kent doesn't care whether the judge said rape or not, but that's an attention getter. What he is after is to impeach the entire trial record. Look, she said rape, and it's not in the official transcript. You can't trust anything the government put out. But there's no good reason to believe that claim, and that's a whole nother, a little more complicated story to delve into, maybe beyond the reach of what we want to discuss today. But I throw it out there for those that want to look into it. Check it out and see if you're interested in that aspect of it.
Another question from the audience. What is the bit about the rape? Could you explain that, please?
Kent claims at his sentencing, at some point, Judge Rogers said, "You're worse than a rapist," or "Your crimes are worse than rape, so I'm going to give you 10 years. There's no really, you can narrow down where that statement might have been said according to what Kent alleges, but there's really no place in there for it. And there's no good reason to think that the judge would have said such a stupid thing. And the point, the rape is an attention getter. The point Kent wants to make, from what I've heard him say, is that the official record is not credible. Here's one instance, they said something and conspired to have it extracted for whatever reason. And in conjunction with that, Kent lays it out in the context of, she said that, and so I'm going to give you 10 years. If you look at the law, structuring itself provides 5 years in prison. And if it's in conjunction with another crime, because it's a standalone crime, whether you're a drug runner or a Baptist preacher cheating on their taxes, is not relevant. If you structure, it's a crime all itself. But if you're structuring and drug running or a Baptist preacher cheating on your taxes, it's 10 years. So when structuring is in conjunction with another crime, you can get 10 years. Kent likes to say, I should only got 6 months. They gave me 10 years. And it's in the context of Judge Rogers said I was worse than a rapist, so I'm going to give you 10 years. That's not how it works. That's not how it works. And ultimately, from the reporting I've done on it and some of the people I associate with, what we've come up with is in the sentencing of Joe Hovind, his wife, which took place later, Eric Hovind, Kent's son.
The favorite son.
Yeah, the heir apparent. In testifying at the sentencing for his mother, he injects rape into the discussion by suggesting that Kent got sentenced to more time than some rapists or some who are convicted of rape. Some have concluded that's where this whole rape thing came, not from Judge Rogers bringing it up, but from Eric bringing it up. And I think Eric himself somewhere has indicated he didn't hear Judge Rogers say that, and he was there. Jen Fishburne, who was a Hovind sympathizer, she was there as well at Kent's sentencing. And she made contemporaneous online reports of the sentencing. Pretty thorough, pretty good reports.
Mm.
And she has said, if the judges said that, I would not have missed it. She didn't hear it. And everybody can look at the evidence and make up their own mind. Kent has a scheme involving another tax cheat who is still in prison to put out this rape allegation and try to support it by getting other people to sign affidavits that they heard it long after the fact.
Yeah.
So it's a fascinating part of it. I'd like to learn more about that scheme and how it played out, but we may never get there. Any other questions coming in?
I have a question about what percent of Hovind's followers do you think know about the reality of his financial dealings?
Well, I'd like to think my ministry has done some good in increasing the percentage, whatever it is. A lot of people I've run across that have been Hovind supporters don't seem to know much about it and don't seem to care, which is an interesting aspect to the whole thing. I like the guy. What do I care? He cheated the IRS. Duh. What do I care about the IRS getting cheated? It's not considered in some respects high on people's concern.
Right.
When I worked for the IRS, we had another government employee come into our office and threw an ashtray at one of our agents, and she got a $50 fine. We thought it was going to be open season. You know, people be coming in with $50 bills. Where's the agent? I want to throw an ashtray. You know, it just has been a social thing where people don't get too excited if it's the IRS. But it's not the IRS, it's the American people. It's our way of life. It's our tax system. And Kent's sovereign citizen background is basically what's influenced him in developing his anti-government. He doesn't like to say he's anti-government, but that's what it is. He's anti-government.
Oh yeah.
as far as any practical nomenclature is concerned.
Yeah, I mean that I definitely believe that because or that he's anti-government because recently we had the Vegas shooting, and he has come out with Alex Jones and the other conspirators saying that it was a false flag attack, that the government's trying to take away our guns, which is just ludicrous.
That's one of the latest things he's done that has gotten him some attention. I sometimes think he's not interested in the merits of what he does. It's an attention getter, and he's got some attention. And if it's conspiratorial, all the better. He's into that. So that's consistent with some of his other problems. A lot of the things don't involve, this is his only problem scenario. He's got lots of problems. And how he's come out on that is just one of them. You've got to think about chemtrails and 9/11.
Oh yeah, anti-vaxxer. They're anti-vaxxers too, aren't they?
Anti-vaxxer, yeah. One of the best kept secrets going currently is what happened to his anti-vaxxer new wife, second wife, Mary Tocco. She appears to have disappeared from the compound, and he's quit featuring her in videos, talking much about her. Once in a while, he'll mention her and her business, recommend her videos, but she seems to have disappeared and nobody's talking.
Huh. Very interesting.
They were married a year, September 24th. And nothing I saw said anything about any first anniversary celebration.
Very interesting. Very interesting.
There was talk, I think his handler, Ernie Land, mentioned at some point that they did have a prenup. And so I'm wondering if the prenup has become operational and it requires that both of them keep their mouth shut about any split up.
Huh.
That's just my speculation.
Very interesting. So is there any more you want to put out there on this topic, or would you like to move to the FFRF one?
If that's all...
that's all the questions
we can move along, and maybe if we have time, we can come back to some of the other propositions concerning Hovind.
Yeah.
The FFRF case involves their challenge of the income tax-free ministerial housing allowance, Internal Revenue Code section 107, which is fairly simple, probably one of the simplest, straightforward sections of tax law you'll find. Takes up about half a page. And there's two parts to it, basically. Part one is that if the minister lives in a house owned by the church, he doesn't have to pay tax on the value of it. That's where it originally started, like in 1920. Then in the 1950s, they added a provision that says you can pay the preacher in cash, he can get his own house. And as long as you designate it as housing, he can spend as much as he wants. So you have people like Joel Osteen in his $10 million house. And similarly, the Myers, Joyce Myers, and so many others.
Good old, was it the Prosperity Gospel?
Yeah, some of them are very good at that. Then you have the local preacher at your corner Baptist church that has to work 2 jobs plus get paid a meager housing allowance and maybe a little extra, maybe just a housing allowance. That doesn't have very much tax effect on any case, but he gets that housing tax-free in cash. Or if the little church happens to have a house, you can stay in it tax-free. That's the basic law that they're challenging, because the First Amendment says the government should not have any laws respecting the establishment of religion.
Mm.
And there are other provisions of the law, independent of any religious claims, that provide for tax-free, income tax-free housing. And ministers, some of them, you do your tax planning and construct your affairs. Churches can do this as well as individual preachers in such a way that they can take advantage of different tax provisions. But they typically don't do that. They have their special law only for them. And as Judge Crabb has ruled now twice, the cash portion of that, she didn't really consider the in-kind provision, but it's sitting back there also waiting to be declared unconstitutional on the same basis. But she didn't specifically reach that issue. But on the cash provision, she's ruled twice it's unconstitutional. The first time, the appeals court said, we're not going to argue with you about it being unconstitutional. We're just going to tell you shouldn't have even made the decision because they lacked what's called standing. You have to have standing to ask the court to decide an issue you think is important to you. So they decided then they didn't have standing. So they reconstructed their legal strategy and came back again with a new standing claim. And she again said, yeah, they got standing. And I'm again ruling it's unconstitutional. So we're back, once they finalize the case, back to an appeal situation, and we'll see what the appeals court does. My favorite part of the case, it's kind of personal to me because I've been in it so long, has to do with the references to basketball ministers. That was in her decision, and that's really where the FFRF case finds its genesis, if you want to use that term. The IRS has been quite generous in expanding who gets the housing allowance, who qualifies for the housing allowance, which is part of the whole entanglement issue that should raise a red flag when it comes to understanding why it's bad law. Back when I was working for the service, Internal Revenue Service, early 80s maybe. I'm getting so old I can't remember all the details, and this is a casual conversation. But back during that time frame, a lady at work, a revenue agent, came up to me and asked me about a case she was working on. And I answered her question. It had to do with the housing allowance. And I told her, I don't think he's entitled to that housing allowance. That's just a private school. He was a basketball coach at a private school. And she took my advice for what it was worth. The issue wound up being raised, and the housing allowance he was claiming was proposed to be disallowed. And after much administrative wrangling and being set for court 2 or 3 times, with the indications there was some political, administrative stuff going on behind the scenes, the government backed down, and the basketball coach got his tax-free housing allowance based on the claim that this private school was an integral agency of the church. Now you call up the private school and say, "Are you an agency of the church?" Nope. We've been specifically designed not to be. Our founders didn't want it to be. But members of the church are interested in education, and we run the place.
Mm-hmm.
And that was the contrivance the government came up with to expand, in this one case, who would get it. Now, it just so happens that particular church, just about anybody claimed to be a minister. And the government is going to keep their hands off. That's religion. We keep our hands off. If you want to tell everybody they're ministers, that's fine with us.
Hmm.
And so when it comes time for a housing allowance, the church says they're a minister, and the IRS has to let them have their housing allowance. Even if they're a basketball school at a private school, basketball coach at a private school that claims it is not an agency of the church. But they have to have that church agency connection to get the housing allowance. Now, why would the IRS come to that conclusion? Why? It's like a handout. There's no compelling. It's a private school. Its tax exemption is based on it being an educational organization, not a religious organization. Why would how did the IRS ever get the notion to do something stupid like that? Now you've got the basketball coach, the math teacher, the dean, the president, all the way down the line, claiming these housing allowances, income tax free. I happen to know a little bit about why the IRS did that. And that goes back even further. I found out after that basketball coach was able to win his case and see what the history was on that. For years and years, these private schools, Abilene Christian in Texas particularly, had been trying to get the IRS to let them give their employees tax-free housing. And at least twice, there were administrative rulings that said, nope, you don't qualify. You as much as admit that you're not an agency of the church, and that would be key to being able to give you your employees these housing allowances. Apparently, Abilene Christian didn't think that should be the end of it, so they started paying their people tax-free housing, and the IRS came knocking, and they were charged with a bunch of employment taxes. And so that's going through the administrative process. And ultimately, they called in George Herbert Walker Bush and Omar Burleson, who were at that time big Texas politicians. They went knocking on the IRS door and said, we think you ought to do something about our constituents down in Abilene. And this is at the highest levels of the IRS. And ultimately, the IRS rolled over and said, okay, we'll recognize Abilene Christian as an integral agency of the church simply because the church folks are running it.
Wow.
And that history is not very well known. And that was what came out in the case of the basketball coach that I was involved with, not personally in his case, but was aware of it. And in spite of that, in spite of my years of trying, there's simply no administrative or political will to do anything about it. Jump forward a few years, and you find the IRS questioning the amount, not that he was not entitled to a tax-free housing, but the amount, on technical computational grounds, the amount Rick Warren should have as a tax-free housing allowance. his was running like $80,000 a year or something like that, tax-free housing. And so the IRS came knocking and said, you'd miscalculated it, you owe us a few more dollars. And it went to court, tax court, I guess, or district court. I don't remember which one. And then I think it was up on appeal before the Ninth Circuit, ultimately. And in a very unusual move, according to the experts, Congress and the president passed a law almost like that to get Rick Warren off the hook and allow him to win his case. Ninth Circuit dismissed it based on that law change. Well, actually, the law changed, and so the government filed to dismiss it, and the case was over. Before it was over, though, what really got them excited to move toward getting the law changed was the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. I think it was the appeals court, not the lower court, on its own motion, which is a little unusual, looked at the housing allowance claim and said, this looks funny to us. I think we ought to raise the constitutional issue. And that sent shockwaves through the ministers' community. And they asked Erwin Chemerinsky, a celebrity lawyer of sorts, to brief the constitutional issue. But then they changed the law, filed motions to dismiss it. Chemerinsky tried to fight it, and the Ninth Circuit Court told him, sorry, we can't help you. Start over and file a standalone suit if you want to press the constitutional issue. And he said he would do so. I followed up and followed up and followed up, and Chemerinsky always had other things to do, and ultimately was selected to head this law school in University of California at Irvine, I think, which may be where he's still at. And so he finally told me that, he's just not going to get around to it. So that was back in 2008, I think. And I was kind of deflated at the time. What now? Is it over? Well, I don't know how I came up with the idea, but I thought, why not ask Annie Gaylor to take it up where Chemerinsky left off? And while there's a lot of things happened in the course of that conversation, ultimately she decided to do so. And that's a little bit of the not so well-known history of that case that you may never hear about anywhere else as the case proceeds. And since that time, that the FFRF diversified into challenging the IRS on IRC 107, they also added their lawsuit about the Forms 990 that churches are exempt from filing, claiming that should not be allowed, and also the electioneering law, the Johnson Amendment rule. So they've expanded quite a bit since I first suggested to Annie that she take up Chemerinsky's cause. And they're seemingly developing quite a bit of expertise now in that area. So don't tell anybody; it could get me killed.
Well, we're just here on YouTube, and this video should be up in
YouTube
perpetuity.
with the whole world watching. There's two issues I've helped Peter J. Riley mount his Forbes career on. He's a Forbes contributor specializing in tax matters. And I ran across him back in 2012, maybe, when he posted an article about a horn player, a famous horn player. I can't think of his name, but he had a housing allowance case where he lost in part and won in part. I think the big deal in his case was whether he could claim the housing allowance on 2 houses and not just one. But Forbes covered it, and when I saw that on Forbes, I commented on it, and Peter and I struck up a relationship, and I talked him into covering the FFRF case on the housing allowance, which he did not seem particularly familiar with at that time. And so he has done so, and he's written many, many articles for Forbes on that, some of which my fingerprints are all over. And I tried to get him involved in Kent Hovind's case, but it's hard to make the tax connection at that time. But when Kent's wife's personal income tax case came down from the tax court, it pricked his interest. And from that time, he's covered her case and his case as well, and probably posted 60 Forbes articles on Hovind and another 30 or so, 40 or so on the FFRF case. And both stories continue to develop. And Peter's done a great deal of work. I've always said those 2 cases, as far as I'm concerned, don't get the attention they deserve. But he has done a great work, in my opinion, in covering them. We don't always agree on some of the details, but we've had a great relationship, and he's patronized my hobbies quite well for his own purposes, which is justified, of course, and hope to see him do so in the future.
Yeah, I remember he mentioned you in one of the articles you sent me, which I'll have to go back and find so I can link it in the description.
Yeah, he likes to refer to me as the bane of basketball ministers when he's talking about the FFRF case, and once in a while he'll mention me also in his Hovind coverage. I'd like to see more, but everybody's got their own interests, and I guess the mainstream still figures they got bigger fish to fry.
Well, I think this is all very important stuff, and I'm very glad that we have you here to talk about it today.
Yeah, thank you. I appreciate the opportunity. I guess we have found enough to keep us busy for the time allotted.
You can raise any more issues or questions if you want. Let me see. We don't really have any. RJ asked, what were the jurists ruling on that minister case? Federal, I assume. That's what he said.
On which minister's case?
It doesn't specify. RJ, which case? He'll probably be back in a second to tell us. In the meantime, though, do you have any other points you'd like to raise?
Well, let me bring up another one of my hobbies that ties back to Kent Hovind.
Okay.
Kent Hovind, I guess he prefers to be called, as I mentioned earlier, doesn't like to be called a sovereign citizen, but he exhibits the same symptoms common to what is commonly called sovereign citizens. And that's an anti-government kind of thing, the type of people that kill police officers if they get stopped for traffic violations and stuff. I don't believe they should have a driver's license, and all sorts of intermediate types of behavior and claims. Kent likes to brag about how some now he used to mention the guy's name more often, but now he mentioned some guy that came and spent 15 months with him developing his legal narrative, which is now in a series of DVDs you can go to on the internet and read, and then hopefully do what Kent asked you to do and send letters to important people. And Kent claims that'll get him his 2006 convictions reversed and get him millions in damages for false imprisonment. That's at KentHovind.com. The man's name is Brady Byram. Brady Byram. You can Google him and find out all sorts of things about him. He's a sovereign citizen of sorts that likes to go around and get involved in other people's case. Typically, if he goes to the courthouse and tries to get involved, they throw him out because he's not an attorney or a paralegal. He's just a loudmouth. But he spent all these months with Kent, part of which were living on his compound down in Alabama, and produced this product. And during that time, he also got hooked up with a couple in northern Alabama, Heflin, Alabama, who thought it would be kind of neat to go off into an isolated place in a state park and have an unassisted birth. So they wound up at Chia State Park in northern Alabama, 9 months pregnant, going into labor, thinking, we'll just have this baby here and nobody will know, we'll just disappear and move on. Well, they didn't quite make it. I had to call 911 after a couple of days in labor, reportedly. They were having forest fires and other things going on. And so there was plenty of first responders around. So they descended on the campsite and took him to the hospital. And they didn't behave very well at the hospital. And they wound up having the baby taken into state custody after about a day in the hospital. And that's what's known as the baby home case, HOLM. Shortly thereafter, Brady Byram shows up to help them supposedly try to get their baby back using his sovereign citizen tactics. Obviously, that was destined to failure. But they've now been pressing the sovereign citizen nutcase issues for a year. And they even left Alabama the last few months, the parents, and said they were never coming back, as if to leave the kid to be adopted into a much better home. But they showed up back in Heflin and now supposedly are trying to get the baby back again. And they appear to be certifiably mentally ill and not wanting to do anything about it. But Brady Byram got involved early, Kent's man, and early on pulled his sovereign citizen tactics. I think that's another case that needs a lot more attention than it's getting. But people can Google that and do what they want with it and form their own opinions. And Kent, even at one point in one of his videos, supposedly was a little irritated at Brady for getting involved in that case because he was down there eating off Kent Hovind's table, and Kent didn't want to pay for the baby home case attention. What that's all about, I don't know, but Kent does address it. And the reason I found out about it is because Kent's handler, Ernie Land, was bragging about it in a YouTube video as if he really thought Brady was going to be successful in suing the state of Alabama for $1 billion because they took this baby with reasonable cause. Because these parents were transients. They didn't want to cooperate. They didn't want to tell anything.
Mm.
And they were acting consistent with mental issues. But Brady was Kent's man Ernie was high on it and shot off his mouth in one of Rudy Davis's videos. Rudy Davis is Kent's main YouTube promoter, or was at one time. And I'm of the opinion that everybody associated with that matter wished Ernie Land has kept his mouth shut. Because that set me on a course ultimately to set up a Facebook group that specialized in following the Baby Home case, and it currently has 450.
I found a page for it.
Yeah, understanding the Baby Home case. It includes about 450 members now, a few of which are local people involved in the child welfare issues, familiar with the case, and we've developed the truth of that. While if you go anywhere else, you're apt to find a lot of misleading information and outright falsehoods about what's going on. And all of that is in the context of what is apparently a very large, well-financed, local group of people specialized in attacking the government because of child welfare issues. And the Baby Home case is not a case to try and make for changing the child welfare system. Any government agency can stand some improvement, but what they've tried to make out of this case is not what it is. If anything, the Baby Home case is an example of when they do things right. And so that's another case with the FFRF and Hovind that is live and current and developing. And in the early going of the Baby Home case, the people that were pushing the parents' side of it and reporting on it never mentioned Brady Byram by name. They mentioned some guy from Texas saw something and decided to just show up and help out, or Texas paralegal. And now Brady's fallen off the map, kind of like Mary Taco. Nobody knows where he is or what he's up to. I heard he got his car impounded recently, and is having to hitch rides because he didn't have registration or license. I don't know if that's true or not, but people tell me things, and you got to wonder. Brady has not been very open in public. He likes to work undercover, under the rock, as it were. But he comes out once in a while and does some things which you can find on the internet and make your own evaluations as to what he's all about. Supposedly he raised his kids in that belief, and some of them had trouble trying to adapt to normal society when they didn't have social security numbers and such. So it's a problem. It goes to the Bundy case. They're all over the Bundy case. Pete Santilli recently got out of jail, made a deal. Pete Santilli, at one point, after interviewing Kent's man Rudy Davis on his show, called in 2015. Kent was going through some other legal commotions. Then Pete called Kent's judge in Florida and ranted and raved and apparently tried to threaten and intimidate her. I have that transcript on my Hovind page, standalone page, for those interested in that. He might well have been prosecuted for that. But apparently so far it looks like they figure they got him on enough that unless he does something new, he's off the hook. But it's an example of how so many of these things tie together. The the Bundy bunch and what all they were doing in Bunkerville and the Malheur Reserve involved these sovereign citizen types who were trying to do their thing and get publicity and claim this and claim that. And so it's all part of the contemporary scene. But Kent Hovind, in my opinion, is not getting the attention he's due. And I was down at his place last week, I guess it was, which is why he mentioned me recently.
Mm-hmm.
And
Stirring him up.
yeah, I was told that he apparently is trying to keep a low profile locally.
Wonder why.
Yeah, a lot of people down there still don't know what's going on over on Pearl Lane and near Lenox. And so he's still got money to operate on, doing his thing, and refuses to come out and be held accountable.
We have a question about Kent Hovind. How much money was recovered from Hovind?
Well, they seized the real property and sold some of it at auction, some of which Eric bought back, much of which Eric bought back. I think the government may still own 2 or 3 smaller residences. And so I'm not sure the total recovery, several $100,000, I suppose.
Oh, okay.
I suppose someone on Kent's side keeps account of the money angle. It would be nice to get an accounting as to how much has been collected and how much he owes. He has another angle is, in my opinion, he's set up what's called nominee corporations to try and keep the IRS from seizing anything else. He keeps it hidden in those corporations. And for some reason, one of those, the IRS granted tax-exempt status to. But they're not looking? I don't know why they would do that. And maybe that'll change in the future at some point. But for now, that's where the 145 acres and improvements is, registered to his tax-exempt corporation that Ernie Land effectively operates. And then there's supposedly a private for-profit corporation, which who knows what they're into. But it shields the money from the IRS unless the IRS gets aggressive on establishing these are just alter ego nominee entities, and those corporations are the same as Kent Hovind individually and go after the property. I'd like to see that. The Conecuh County, where the property is located, is not one of your wealthier counties in Alabama or the country, from what I understand. And yet, when they were asked for property tax purposes to exempt the whole 145 acres, they did so. I think a case could be made that a lot less than the 145 acres should be exempted, if any. But for now, it's fully exempt for local property tax purposes. Last I heard.
I have 2 more questions for you. Then we can call it good. The first one is back to the basketball minister.
Yes.
What were the jurist ruling on that case?
The Judge Crabb's ruling refers to an article by Adam Shotaro, law school professor in Arizona. And in that article, he refers to the Jobe case, Jobe.
Okay.
Jerry Jobe was the minister in Oklahoma that I referred to earlier, the basketball minister.
Mhm.
In tax court, you don't have a jury. In tax court, the IRS issues you a determination letter. If you want to appeal it or legally contest it, the taxpayer files a petition with the tax court. That's the simplest option if you want to litigate. So Jerry Jobe, represented by the Big Guns law firm at the university, filed his petition with the tax court to contest the ruling that he wasn't entitled to the housing allowance. In tax court, there's no jury. The judge makes a decision. In his case, as I mentioned earlier, it was scheduled for trial 2 or 3 times while stuff was going on behind the scenes. And ultimately, the government said, we don't want to litigate that issue. Give it to him. So the case was dismissed without the court having to decide the issue. And he got his ruling and effectively set a precedent of sorts, not legally precedent perhaps, but practically a legal precedent that don't try to disallow any more housing allowances at our school. We got the IRS in our pocket.
The other question I want to ask, this will be the last one, is what are your thoughts on the ARC Encounter's financial dealings?
I've watched that like a lot of people, and it gets above my pay grade. I've read a little bit about it. It looks like some things are going on. It's hard to get the best account of what's really going on. I think Ham has probably gotten more than he's entitled to or deserves. And it may take a while longer before we find out just how bad the boondoggle of an ARC is going to be. Maybe it'll struggle along for a lot of years with or without the tax incentives. I just don't know. I'm a very casual observer of that, and not more insightful than anybody else. I think Peter Riley at Forbes has written some pretty good articles on it, but it's just part of what's out there for those that need something to put them to sleep at night.
Yeah, I've seen a bit of it. I remember it was all over the news when he sold the park for $10 so they could
and then took it back.
Yeah, and then they took it back because they were basically threatened.
I wondered what are they doing to exploit the ministerial housing allowance? They got a lot of people on their payroll, and they can declare them all ministers and pay them in income tax-free housing. But I don't think I've seen anything that attempts to document the extent to which they are using that. It seems like they could exploit it with the IRS blessing, the way the IRS is administering that provision of the law currently. I mean, if the basketball coach at Pepperdine University can get it, why not the tour guide at the ARC Encounter?
Yeah, it's fair. Okay. Well,
now, we know the people at Pepperdine and Abilene and other private schools like that are getting it, but I haven't seen any journalistic coverage trying to detail how it might be exploited by Ken Ham at the museum or the ARC Encounter, either one.
Okay. Well, I think we're going to cut it here. Again, thank you so very much for coming today.
Okay. If you get a lot of requests, you'll have me back and we can zero in on some other things,
I bet,
or just report the latest news. Thanks again for having me.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, everyone who was here today. All right, so gonna cut it off. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Bye-bye.